Hi, I'm Gareth, and in this video we're going to tackle a harmonization of a 6-bar melody that involves extreme modulation and is also going to take us into the realms of chromatic harmony. Because I know there are many people who are fairly happy to choose some basic chords for a melodic line, many people who are happy to go further than that, maybe to use all the chords of diatonic harmony, in other words, the chords in the key, people who are happy to modulate to nearby keys, but maybe are less happy when the melody becomes a bit more chromatic, or when they've got to go to a more extreme key and they're not quite sure how to get there. Because the conventional way of moving from one key to another is to find a pivot chord. In other words, you're in one key, you're going to another key, and you're trying to find a chord that appears in this key and in this key. So if you've got one chord that belongs to both of these keys, you can use it as a pivot chord. And often you've got more than one possibility for a pivot chord. So if you're in C major and you want to go to G major, it's only one key away. You've only added one sharp, lots of pivot chords. If you want to go to F major from C major, it's only got one flat, so lots of pivot chords. But if you want to do something much more extreme, like go from C major to A flat major or D flat major or B major or F sharp major, then it's difficult to find pivot chords. And if you want to get there by pivot chords, you'll have to go through a number of other keys on the way until you discover a pivot chord. But what happens if you haven't got the luxury of all the space and time to do that? You just need to throw yourself straight into another key. Well, that's the sort of thing we're going to be talking about today. What happens if you've got all sorts of chromatic notes in your melody that don't belong to the key? We're going to be talking about that too. Okay, well, on the board is a 6-bar melody. 3 flats in the key signature. Well, that means it's either in E flat major or it's in C minor. It's in E flat major. How do we know that? Well, one obvious indicator is that it starts with an E flat and it finishes with an E flat. So that's kind of usefully pointing E flat major, but you can't take it for granted because E flat is also a note in the tonic chord of C minor. So there's always the possibility that that's not telling you the whole story. I'm going to suggest that the B flats that you see in the penultimate bar are the bigger indicator that this is in E flat major. Why do I say that? In C minor, you'd expect them to be B naturals probably. And they're not B naturals, they're B flat. So what's the final cadence going to be? It will be very difficult to find a decent cadence in the key of C minor for the end of this. But if you're in E flat major, you can have a perfect cadence. You can go 5-1 in E flat major. So that's the thing that really confirms our home key as E flat major. Okay, well, let's make a start harmonizing this melody, and then we're going to deal with the various challenges that present themselves along the way. Well, possibly the easiest chord choices to make are the first one and the last one. It's possible if the last chord were going on that you could use a chord 6 or a chord, maybe a chord 4, although we probably want a cadence, so 1 or 6 are probably the most likely options. But there's a double bar at the end. For our purposes, we're treating it as the end of the piece. So really that idea of it being 1 is the most reliable. You might even go a step further and say, well, you know what, I'm going to have a perfect cadence here, so it's going to go 5-1. Which makes the point, when you're harmonizing, you don't always necessarily get the best outcome by starting at the beginning and progressing chord by chord. You also want to look at the total picture and you want to see the context of any given moment. And I'm going to show why that's really important in this case. Okay, well, we're in E flat major. That's all cool. Chord 1 fits here. I can look at the D and think, well, you know, chord 5 would fit there. So this is all going very comfortably so far. Then I bump into our first challenge because there's a D flat in the melody. So I've got to stop for a moment and think, what is this D flat doing there? It's nothing to do with E flat major, so maybe it's modulating somewhere. Okay, if it is, where is it modulating? Well, we've got D flat, we get D flat again, just to reiterate it, and then it goes to C. Well, if I've got 3 flats in a key signature and the D flat implies a modulation, well, it's the next flat in the sequence, isn't it? So the key with 4 flats is going to be A flat major. Could be F minor, but probably A flat major. So if I'm modulating from E flat major to A flat major, well, that's not going to give me too much stress, is it? Because it's only 1 key away. So maybe the next thing to do is to think, okay, let's start thinking of heading to A flat major. So we'll just kind of put A flat there for a moment. We could use a 4 in A flat major because D flat belongs to chord 4, or the D flat could be the 7th of a 5/7, and that might make it a little bit stronger. So let's just go there for a moment where we think 5/7, and then we're heading for a 1 in A flat major. The D flat comes twice. We're going to have to think about that in a moment. But if this is going 5/1 or 5/7/1 in A flat major, well, that could be as straightforward as a modulation to A flat major, although I don't think we continue in A flat major because we're soon somewhere else. So it's a bit momentary, isn't it? You know, we've just gone 5/1 or 5/7/1 in A flat major, and then we're on the move again. So is it a modulation or is it a secondary dominant? Just to be clear about secondary dominance, this is when you're in a key and you just decide to go 5/1 or 5/7/1 in another key. And the 1 in this other key should be a chord in the prevailing key. Now, if you think about it, 1 in A flat major would be A flat, C, E flat, and that's also called 4 in E flat major. So that would qualify as a secondary dominant. So if we're starting in E flat major, we have a secondary dominant in A flat major, then we carry on in E flat major, which is what normally happens with a secondary dominant, then that's what we're looking at. Well, can we carry on in E flat major? We're going to have a look at that in a moment. But it's looking promising for the time being. Okay, now let's get to work on the first bit, thinking about a bass line. Well, I think E flat is the most likely bass part there. If it's chord 5, I could jump down to B flat or jump up to B flat, and then I could jump somewhere else to E flat or something for the 5/7. I wonder if there's a way I can smooth the bass line a little bit so we haven't got too much leaping around. And I wonder if there's a way in which we can get the top and the bottom, the soprano and the bass parts, moving in contrary motion, which is normally a good idea. Well, I think we might be able to do it like this. Okay, yeah, let's do that, and then I'll talk about that movement in just a tick. So, can you see what we've done there? We've got the bass going up by step, while the soprano is sort of coming down by step. Okay, now what does this imply? Well, this could be a 5, it could be a 5/7, C. Because it's in second inversion, I'm inclined to make it a 7th because that's a bit richer. If you've just got a second inversion chord, it's okay. If I put a 7th in it, it just strengthens it a little bit. So that second inversion will feel a bit tighter there. Okay, so I've got a nice top and bottom that does this. So you can kind of feel that movement in the bass. There's a nice counter movement to what's happening in the soprano part. Okay, let's get some other parts in. So I'm just sort of filling out the chords, but I'm sort of thinking about what's the most sensible way of doing it. I could have had the G and the tenor and the B flat and the alto, but there would have been too big a gap in the middle, so that wouldn't be good spacing. Remember, try to avoid more than an octave between 2 neighbouring parts, except for the tenor and the bass. So that'll be a better spacing. I've got to get my 7th in somewhere, so if I put it in the alto, There are two advantages. It makes the alto go by step, which is nice. It also means the tenor can repeat this B flat. So when you're moving from one chord to the next, if you've got one note in common between those two chords and you use it in the same part, it has a kind of sort of binding effect and smooths the transition between one chord and the next. So it's always a good thing to do. And people often worry that they've got too many repeated notes, particularly in the alto part. That tends to happen. If you find you've got repeated notes in the alto part, it's often a sign that you're writing good harmony. I can think of one hymn that's got 29 E flats in the alto part, which is possibly about 23 too many. But at least it's showing there's some stability, even if it's boring for the altos to sing. Okay. And I should perhaps have said that we're doing this in a sort of standard 4-part layout, SATB, soprano, alto, tenor, bass, or you could play it on a keyboard for 4 parts. But once we've done the harmony, I mean, you could arrange this in any way. It could be a melody as part of a song, an accompaniment that's much freer. You could have instruments playing, do whatever you want to do with it. But it's just how do we do the basic harmony that we're onto here. Okay, now, if I'm going to use this 5/7 there, but I've got G in the bass, well, it's going to be a 5/7 B, isn't it, in order to keep this moving. Before I go on, I've got to have a think about this D flat, haven't I? Because the D flat here is fine. It belongs to the 5/7 B. What's the D flat doing here? It doesn't really belong to 1, does it? The C does, but the D flat doesn't. I could harmonize this D flat. I could say, well, we could say it's 4C to 1. So I go 5/7 B in A flat to 4C to 1. Perfectly reasonable way of doing it. Or I could look at this D flat and think that could be a suspension. Okay, so just to be sure what we're talking about here, if you want to write a suspension, it has to have 3 phases: prepare, sound, resolve. Prepare and sound must be the same note, and going from sound to resolve must move by step, nearly always downwards. So this seems to fit, doesn't it? Because P fits the 5/7 B, R fits the 1, P and S are the same note, S is moving to R downwards by step, and S will be dissonant with the chord. Well, D flat doesn't belong to chord 1, so we've ticked all the boxes here for a suspension. And we would call this a 4/3 suspension because D flat's a 1/4 above the bass, C is a 1/3 above the bass. So you describe S and R as a 4/3 suspension. Okay, let's fill in the other parts. Well, the alto could nicely progress up the scale there. Gives us nice tense with the bass part, doesn't it? And keeps things kind of moving in a scale-like way, not jumping around too much. I think the tenor is going to have to jump a little bit at this point, but we can use that to our advantage because if we go up a 4th to E flat, we can use E flat again here. And again, we get this binding together, moving from one chord to the next because the E flat belongs to 5/7 B and belongs to 1. I could just now put an A flat in the alto and we would complete this movement. Or I could do this. So what have I done here? By putting that B flat in the alto, I've created a double suspension because P, S, R. Okay, P and S, same note. S to R, going by step. P belongs to this chord, yes it does. R belongs to this chord, yes it does. S is dissonant, yes it is. Above the bass, it's 9/8. So I would describe the alto as a 9/8 suspension. So it sounds like this. That's rather nice. If I'd just had the single suspension at the top, sounds good. Double suspension, I think, sounds even better. So there we are, how to decorate what you're doing with a double suspension. And you can see this B flat sort of harnessing this move, the E flat harnessing this move. Nice bit of scale work in the alto, kind of working intense with the bass. You know, we've got nice polarity between the top and the bottom. So, you know, all the hallmarks of good harmony, really, in evidence there. Lovely. That's got us over the first step. So we've so far written this. Okay. Now I said a moment ago that if this is a secondary dominant, then we normally expect to carry on an E flat major. And you're probably looking at this thinking, yeah, okay, get out of this one, because what's that C flat doing there? Well, C flat doesn't look as if it's taking us back to E flat major, does it? There's no C flat in E flat major. So what could be happening here? Well, there are possibilities. Let's just look on, because remember, I'm always talking about context. So from this point, we're trying to get back into E flat major. I could easily have a chord 1 here. I could also have a chord 5, actually. But let's call it chord 1 for now. But you can always keep the chord 5 option there. One thing I could do here is to say, I'm going to go 4-1 in E flat major. But if I went 4-1 in E flat major, you'd be saying to me, but 4's got a C natural in it. It should be C natural to B flat. If I borrow 4 from E flat minor, that's a perfectly acceptable thing to do when we're talking about borrowing chords. You borrow from the tonic minor if you're in a major key. Sometimes if you're in a minor key, you might borrow from the tonic major. So not the relative minor or the relative major, but the tonic. So I could use chord 4 in E flat minor followed by chord 1 in E flat major. So it should be 4-1 with a C natural. But I could borrow this 4 from E flat minor. That sounds quite nice, doesn't it? It gives me a little bit of chromatic colour there. So that's one thing I could do. I could go 5-1. Now you're saying, no, he's really lost the plot now. How would you possibly be able to go 5-1 with the C flat there? Well, bear with me. Chord 5, B flat, D, F. Put a 7th on it, that's A flat. Put a 9th on it, that's C. If you have a minor 9th, that's C flat. So I could go 5 minor 9 to 1. So I can borrow 4 from E flat minor, or I can use a dominant minor 9th, a 5 flat 9. There's a third possibility, and that's the one I'm going to put on the board, just so we can see that sometimes there's more than one way of dealing with these things. I'm going to do this. Okay, now what have I written there? So I've written this chord, D, F, A flat, C flat. Now that is a diminished 7th chord. Okay, let's have a think about this. A diminished 7th chord is always a pile of minor thirds, or the equivalent of minor thirds. What do I mean by that? Well, the equivalent of a minor third could be an augmented second. So if you look at all the notes in your chord and you've either got minor thirds piling up, or you've got minor thirds and diminished seconds somewhere, it's going to be a diminished 7th. That's the nature of a diminished 7th. In order to get it into root position, they should be genuine minor thirds. You shouldn't have any augmented seconds. So if you've got augmented seconds and you're not sure which inversion you're in, reorganize it until you've got genuine minor thirds. That will give you the key it's in. Diminished 7ths are normally built on chord 7 in a key. So if we're in E flat major, what's chord 7? Well, chord 7 is D, F, A flat. What have I got here? D, F, A flat. What have I done above the A flat? I've added C flat, another minor third. That's why that is a diminished 7th in the key of E flat major. So that's 3 possible ways of dealing with that C flat. This is the great joy of chromatic harmony and extreme situations. You have to sort of think outside the box of the diatonic chords that belong to the key and get buzzing with your chromatic chords. So there's a diminished 7th, which will flow on to chord 1 very nicely. Let's just complete the detail there. Now, just something to say about this. First of all, I'm sharing the E flat between the tenor and the bass, and you might think that's a slightly weak thing to do. If you do too much of it, yes, it is weak. If you do it occasionally, it's not a problem. Why am I doing it in this case? Well, the bass line has come quite high, isn't it? And arguably you might think, well, why didn't you have the bass an octave lower? I could have done. Actually, Sometimes when you bring the texture closer together like this, you get a slightly more intimate, more intense feel. I'm trying to do that because of the diminished seventh. And then pulling it in here means we've got a really close cut. I could have done this. Sounds all right, but this feels a little bit more intense just for that moment, doesn't it? So there's a reason for doing that. You might also say you don't like the augmented fourth between the A flat in the bass and the D in the tenor. Something you wouldn't normally do is write an augmented fourth, but when you're doing something like this, it adds to the tension to have the A flat in the bass going up to a D. That interval just adds to the tension here. So it's all about context when you do these things. All right, well, here we are. We're back in E flat major. We've justified the existence of our secondary dominant in A flat major. We've even managed to put a double suspension in there. We've considered 3 possibilities for chromatic harmony options with a C flat. And here we are back at home in E flat major. All is well with the world. Until we look at the next note and we see A sharp. And we think, oh my goodness, A sharp, nothing to do with E flat major. So what does that A sharp mean? There's no point in looking at the A sharp on its own, because on its own it doesn't tell us anything. This is where we need to think about context. Where's the A sharp going? A sharp, B, C sharp, D sharp. Okay, well, I wonder if they all belong to a key. Well, A sharp, B, C sharp, D sharp. It sort of feels a bit like B major, doesn't it? So that would make sense if these 4 notes are taking us to B major. Now then, hang on a moment. We're in E flat major. It's got 3 flats. And now you're telling me we're going to B major. It's got 5 sharps. That's miles away, isn't it? Could hardly be further away, could it? So how on earth are we going to get to B major? We haven't got the chance to use a pivot chord to get to the A sharp. Chord 1 in E flat major is nothing to do with B major. That's not a pivot chord. What are we going to do? Well, here's something you can do. In the 19th century, composers loved to do this. Instead of just thinking about using a pivot chord, they started to alight on the idea of using a pivot note. So just one note that belongs to one key, then belongs to another. And I'm going to extend that a notch further here, because you might be looking at this saying, well, where's your pivot note? Well, actually, it's in the soprano, because this is B flat and that's A sharp. B flat, A sharp, same note. Now, the enharmonic equivalents, just to be sure about that term, when the note sounds the same, but it looks different, like B flat to A sharp, it's an enharmonic equivalent. So I'm going to use the soprano enharmonic equivalent as a pivot note. Not a pivot chord, no chance of doing that. A pivot note. The reason why the 19th century composers got onto this is it enabled more extreme modulation, which is what we're into here. So if I can use that as a pivot note to take me into B, there is some hope of achieving this. Okay, now what am I going to do here? Well, I'm probably heading for chord 1 there, aren't I? So really it's looking like a sort of 5-1, 5-1 in the key of B. Let's just establish our new key there. Okay, well, you know, that looks maybe a little bit boring, just 5-1, 5-1. But don't forget you can use inversions. And we're also thinking all the time about how we can get good lines going, how we can get good contramotion going. Well, can I work with this idea? So in the bass, if I go for a C sharp there, and then come down to a B natural, and then come down to an A sharp. Can you see we're getting nice contramotion between the top and the bottom? And then it's probably going to take me onto a B at that point. Okay, let me fill in some of this. So let's get an F sharp in here. Well, let's get an E natural in the tenor. That'd be rather fun, wouldn't it? Now I can repeat the F sharp in the alto. It gives me a bit of stability, especially as we're having a rather radical change of key. D sharp in there would do us. Another F sharp, that's increasing our stability. And a C sharp in the tenor. And, well, let's just go for it. Let's have another F sharp in the alto. And I'll share that. I don't want to write a D sharp there because it's going to give me a double major third, which we try to avoid. It will also give me consecutive octaves with a soprano. So again, there are good reasons for the tenor and the bass to arrive on the same note there. So let's just spruce up our description. We've now got 5-7C going to 1, and then we've got 5B going to 1. So whenever you get those things where you're not going 1-5, 1-5, 1, you think about inversions, think about sevenths. What can we do to make it a little bit more interesting? And we've got this nice contramotion going between the top and the bottom. Okay, so from the diminished seventh in E flat at the end of bar 2, that's the diminished seventh. Here's the 1 in E flat. Here's this enharmonic pivot note. Oh, isn't that great? E flat major, and then this lovely chord, the 5-7C in B major, 1 in B, 5B in B, 1 in B. So you see that actually flows on remarkably well, doesn't it? Even though we've gone from a key with 3 flats to a key with 5 sharps. Whoa. Okay, well, we're nearly home and dry, but we have other challenges to face because here we are in B major. We're just round the corner from a cadence in E flat major. So surely the next note is going to throw us straight back into E flat major. A natural? What? What's A natural doing there? Because that doesn't particularly help us, does it? A natural's not in the key of B major. Neither is it in the key of E flat major. So what a pain that is. What are we going to do here? Let me suggest an option and then we'll talk about how we got there. Okay, what have I done? Well, this also has an implication about the next chord. So I'm going to put 1C, and that is often something that happens in E flat major, isn't it? Well, not in E flat major, but a cadence where you go 1C, 5, 1 at the end. I was just saying E flat major because I'm thinking I need to write E flat major here because we're going back to that key. So what is this chord? You might look at it and think, oh, that looks like another one of these diminished sevenths, but actually you'll find it isn't. The note I've got in the bass is C flat. That's a big clue. What's C flat in E flat major? It's the lowered 6th degree of the scale. Now, if you're on a major key and you've got the lowered 6th in the scale at the bottom of a chord, or if you're in a minor key and you've just got the 6th, you don't have to lower it in a minor key. If you've got that lowered 6th, it's probably telling you that you're dealing with an augmented 6th chord. There are other possibilities, but it might well be telling you that you're dealing with an augmented 6th chord. Okay, so how do I form an augmented 6th chord? I start with the lowered 6th, so that's C flat. Above that, I put an augmented 6th. An augmented 6th above C flat is A natural. Aha! That is the note we have in the melody. So being given that note in the melody, you could have thought that the other way around. You could have thought, what happens if I put an augmented 6th below that? Where does that get me? Lowered 6th degree of the scale. That could be useful. So here's my lowered 6th. Here's my augmented 6th. Put the tonic in the middle. That's the E flat. Once I've got that, the lowered 6th, augmented 6th above it, tonic in the middle, I've got an augmented 6th chord. If I don't add anything else to that, it's an Italian 6th. If I put an augmented 4th in it as well, above the bass, then it's turned into a French 6th. Or if I put a perfect 5th in the middle of it above the bass, I've turned it into a German 6th. This is a German 6th. You could use Italian, you could use French. I'm just choosing to use a German 6th in this case. I think it's the strongest one in terms of where we might progress. How on earth did I get from chord 1 in B major to an augmented 6th in E flat major? Did I just fly into it? Well, no, I didn't actually. Do you notice what's happened? We've actually got 2 pivot notes. F sharp in the alto, G flat in the alto. Again, enharmonic equivalents of the same note, so that's fine. In the bass as well, I'm going from B to C flat. Isn't that great? It's another good reason to have the shared note here so we can facilitate that. So that's fantastic. I've got 2 pivot notes. So I'm going from 1 in B major to the German 6 in E flat major. So there we have it, the German 6. Okay, I just need to finish off now. So this is where if you're going 1C 5-1, the bass is very likely to do this hot cross bun thing. Dominant, dominant, tonic, hot cross buns. So that's quite a useful thing to be able to do. If it's 1C, well, that probably takes the G flat naturally onto a G natural. I can use this E flat again, can't I, to link across the bar. And then, you know, maybe I can do this to get my chord 5, and then this would finish it off. So that would give us a nice bog standard cadence. 1C, 5, and then 1 at the end. Okay. Now I'm just looking at that, actually realizing that by doing this, there's just an implied consecutive octave there, isn't there? So that being the case, maybe it'd be better to keep the B flat upstairs and not have it down there because of those implied octaves. Better to have them doing that than have them in the same direction. Okay, these are the things that happen. The only thing about that cadence, sounds a little bit plain. Well, you know, in the light of all this colourful chromatic harmony, just a little bit boring, nothing wrong with it. But we could maybe spruce it up like this. Let's move the alto so we have a 7th there. So that would just give us a bit more. We could decorate a little bit. So we could have that falling a 3rd before it goes on to F. We could have this falling a 3rd before it goes on to D. So it now sounds like this. We could even go a bit further if we want to keep this chromatic feel going. We could chromatically alter the alto and tenor parts by raising them a semitone. So it now goes like this. Makes it even more colourful, doesn't it? And there we are, mission accomplished. What does it all actually sound like when we put it together? Sounds nice, doesn't it? So there we are. We've dealt with some extreme modulation, 3 flats to 5 sharps. We've dealt with how to use chromatic harmony to achieve that. We've also dealt with suspensions, double suspensions. We've dealt with enharmonic equivalents in the use of pivot notes. And we've worked out how to make slightly boring progressions more colourful. And we've learnt how to use some chromatic chords. And we've looked at one or more places where there's definitely multiple options once you get into this world. So I hope that's useful. So if you're able to harmonise at the moment, fantastic. But hopefully this has helped you to move on to a higher level of being able to deal with this more extreme stuff.